Oh, sorry. I should have yawned before I started recording. Okay, so we're at the elliptical marquee tool here. So if I drag, it's going to make a ellipse. Okay, it can be a long, skinny ellipse. It can be a wide. It can be a circular one. There's lots of things you can do with that. All right, so let's start with these two, the rectangular and the elliptical. Down below here, you're going to see single row and single column. You're not going to need those. Those are for very specific things. You'll never use them in here. But these two are pretty good. Okay. Now, somebody just had a question about making a kind of multiple complex. So we're going to start with, how do we do that? All right. Obviously, not everything we want to select is a perfect rectangle or ellipse. Now, if you notice up here in the options bar, we have these 4 buttons here. The first one is the kind of the singular rectangle. That's what we have here. Every time I drag, I create a new one. If I wanted to add to that selection, I could come select Add to Selection. You're going to see that the tooltip drop down for that. So what happens now is that you can see the cursor changed. It's got a little plus mark next to it, right? And it stays. I don't get the move thing in the middle. It stays now. If I drag another rectangle over that, it's just going to add to that selection. Okay, so I can start to make a complex selection like that. All right. You may ask yourself, well, what if I want to take away from that? I would hit the subtract from selection button. And now it has a little negative sign, a little minus sign next to it. And if I drag a rectangle over that, where those two things overlap, the complex selection I just made and the new selection, it's going to subtract that section. Okay? Now this works out here on the edge, and it works in the middle. Okay? So now my selection is all, and this gets a little complicated to remember sometimes. It is all this here, but not this. And I can illustrate that by changing the color and say coming in here and painting. So anywhere the paint hits is my selection. All right? So complex selections. That's a lovely brown, isn't it? All right. Now, if I went to the elliptical tool, notice if I go to add, it's got the same buttons. I can add to selection. I can start to add rounded pieces to my selections. Okay. The same with subtracting. I can subtract a section, build up a complex thing like that. Okay. So that gives me a lot of options to start with. So I can start selecting something. I can start to modify that selection. And I can come in and deselect and reselect and do all sorts of fun stuff to it. There are some other things that are available. If I go into the select menu, you'll see some things up here. Number one is select all. Command A, that's a very commonly used shortcut because that works for text editors. It works for Photoshop as well. It just selects everything on the layer that you're on. Deselect, so if I wanted to get out of this and unselect all that, if I go type Command D or come hit deselect, it deselects that. This one I use quite a bit is the select the inverse. So if I make a selection, and I'll show you kind of how you use this in a minute, but I don't actually want the thing I selected, I want everything else selected. So I select the inverse. So you're going to see if I click on that, it doesn't look any different. But if I grab my paintbrush, now I'm selected Everything outside of that is selected. Okay?
That's the inverse.
It's the inverse. So it just reverses what the part that's selected. Okay? Once I go back to this, I can still move this around. I'll go ahead and tell you now, as you're doing this, especially when you get later in these projects, you might want to save a selection for later. Okay, it does come up, these more complex Photoshop projects. So if you go to Select, down here at the bottom, you can save a selection, okay? All you really need to do is name that. Something. Make sure it's your current document is selected, because you can select in the new document. Don't worry about channel. I just click OK. Now if I come out here and I do something, I'm working on something else, then I think, oh, I need to make that selection again of that other complex selection. What I do is I go up to the Select menu, click Load Selection, and on the channel menu, it's going to say if you have multiple ones, they'll be listed there. You just click OK, and it brings your selection back up exactly where it was originally. Yeah?
In the videos we watched, she did a lot with the layers. Is that like another way to accomplish the same thing?
Yes. Yes. That's good. It's a good question. Well, it depends. It depends on what you're doing. But right now, this is just kind of, right now we're just kind of conceptualize this as I have an image, I need to select something out of that image. Okay? I'm going to show you, definitely, we're going to get into this, multiple layers and masks and how all that stuff works as we move along. Yeah? Yes. Yes. You use it for both of those things. Now, as I've showed you guys a lot about the rectangular and the elliptical selection. Now, it's a bit of a misdirect, because you actually won't use those two types of selections very often, unless you have something that has perfectly square, round sections you want to select. Okay, selections tend to be much more complex. All right, so our more complex selections, I'm going to deselect that, live down here in this tool. So we have a lasso tool, a polygonal lasso tool, and a magnetic lasso tool. All right. And you probably know what these are for. So you see the lasso. The idea is you kind of lasso what you want. And it's basically a drawing selection, okay? So I can draw with my mouse and select that. You see where I looped? It gets all that stuff when I initially select it. So it allows me to do a complex line, all right? It's not the most refined, because our ability to draw with a mouse or like that is, the selection is only as good as our ability to trace. Our abilities really aren't that good. But I'll show you how we use that. Our next one is the polygonal lasso tool. So this one works by defining a point, click, I click, let go, drag my mouse to where I want it to, click again. Each time that makes a point on a polygon. So it allows me to make perfectly polygonal shapes. That one you use more than you think. And then the next one I'll show you in a minute. Let me show you how to start using these tools a little bit. Let's go to another image here. Let's look at this one. It's a very, very dull image of an office building. Okay, so there might be reasons that I want to say select a window in this office building. Okay, so if I wanted to make somebody look like they were standing and they're looking out, I need to be able to select that and either erase it or allow something to show through from underneath, which we'll talk about how to do later. But I need to make a selection on this. So I need to ask myself, and I don't ask myself literally because you just kind of know after a bit, but what tool am I going to use for that? I won't really go up to the marquee tool because this really only makes selections that are square to the edges of the piece. Obviously, I won't use the elliptical one because it won't fit either. So what I would use for this, I would default over to the polygonal lasso tool. That'll get me started on this. Now, I'm going to show you, as I go through this, we're kind of going to go from simple to more advanced types of selections. Okay, so we will get to where these things get pretty fast and let the computer do some of that selection for us. But right now, I'm going to just do this polygonal lasso tool. So I'm going to zoom in on what I want to select. I don't want to go too far because I still want to be able to see the lines, but I like to zoom in. When you're doing this, make sure that you're getting the work so you can see it. So I'm going to come in here with my polygonal lasso tool, find the corner of that, drag, click, click. Now it's important to note when I get to the other, the last point, I get the little circle that tells me I can complete that selection by clicking there, like that. That allows me to click that. So if I wanted to, I don't know, tint this window red, I could grab my paintbrush. I could, I want to drop that down. That. Paint that out. So that allows me to make that simple selection. Okay. So use the selection tool that best fits what you're doing. All right. Very simple use case. If I wanted to come down here, let's say, and get rid of the text on this curve. Sometimes I just forget my words. On the curve. I'm going to use a thing called content-aware fill here. All right, and this is going to be one you want to use in your project, your first project. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my lasso tool. Okay, so what I want to do, if I'm using a content-aware fill, is I want to make a loose selection. And that's generally what you use the lasso tool for because it's not a precise tool. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to grab, I'm going to set that there. I'm going to draw a loose selection around this text. Try and make sure I don't get any of the asphalt. Like so. Like that. Now I can go up to Edit, Fill, Content Aware, and hit OK, and it kind of screwed it up on me. We'll talk about Content Aware a little bit more in a second. But well, the other thing I can do is come over and grab my clone stamp tool.
How'd you select that color?
I'll show you in a minute. So what I'm doing is I have a loose selection there. But this makes sure that I'm not going outside of that, right? Now I've erased that text, okay? So use the selection tool that best fits your thing. Let's take a look. Let's go and let's talk about content-aware fill for a second.
What is it called?
Content-aware fill. All right, so I'm making selections. Now I'm going to get into how do we do some stuff with those selections. All right. I'm going a little fast on this, but my goal here is to get you guys in the software in a few minutes to kind of play with this stuff a little bit. You just saw me do two things: a content-aware fill and a clone stamp. Those two things allow me to do a lot in terms of erasing portions of images or modifying them. Okay. The content-aware fill is could also be called computer vision fill, if you want to call it that. It means the computer is kind of looking at that. So let's look at this beach image here. This lovely, lovely warm beach image. You know, I like a good snowstorm or two a year, but this 16-degree weather in the morning, it's not my thing. Let's say I want to get rid of this. I want to get rid of this glass. I like the beach picture, but I quit drinking, and I don't want to see this drink anymore. I'm going to grab this selection. You notice I'm making a nice big loose selection around it. What I'm going to do here is a content-aware fill. I'm going to let the computer decide what to fill this space in. So I made a selection. The computer is going to fill that selection. The computer is going to look outside of there. It's going to say, okay, I think I know what he wants. I'm going to fill that space with what I think he knows he wants. All right. And this is one of those things that kind of lives in the edit menu, which I don't really think it should, but it does. That's under the fill. And there's a couple different types of fill here. It usually defaults to content aware. That's what we want. We're going to hit OK. That's going to erase that. Now, if we look at this, we have a pretty good fill there. If we look real close, you can kind of see a line right here, but it's not bad. Content-aware fill is what Tabor Roback used on the military, content-aware military vehicles. Right here. So you can see that he drew an outline of the tank there, used the content-aware. This is the earlier version of content-aware fill. It's not as good as the one it's now. But you can see there's a little bit of outline left. So the computer tried to fill in here. And if we zoom in on this, the computer is kind of replicating part of the landscape here. And it tries to decide where it's going to go, where the sky is, where the ground is. The thing is with this computer-aided types of operations is the computer doesn't know what it's looking at, right? It doesn't know it's a tank. It doesn't really know it's a landscape. It's getting to where it'll know it's a landscape or a person, but it doesn't know the nuances of that. And Tabor Roback used that to his advantage here and left that trace. You also know I made a kind of a loose selection. He made a bit of a tighter selection on that so that it was a little more evident where the line was of that object. When I made the loose selection, it's so I didn't have any kind of outline of that object. Yeah.
Is there a way to still get his effect?
Yes. So you can do, you can kind of trace that object a lot closer, and it'll give you a possibility of having a much more defined. Or we can use the clone stamp tool, which I'm going to show you in a second. Okay. All right. So I'm going to step back here. So essentially, what I talked about the computer content-aware fill, kind of selecting stuff from outside of this selection and kind of putting it in there. Essentially, what the computer is doing, it's cloning area from one part of the image to the other. Okay. And that's doing a clone stamp. So the computer's kind of doing it fancy, and it's blending it together. What I'm going to show you now is kind of how to do that on your own. Okay, so clone stamp tool is this guy here. It looks like a stamp. And how you use that is you hold the Option key down. You get this little crosshair. What I'm going to do is click once. I'm going to let up. Now I'm going to move the brush tool to where I want to start cloning that to. Okay? So if I move it up here into the sky, you're going to see a little preview of what I would clone. So now if I click the mouse, sorry, my background is locked. If you're going to paint, you got to unlock that. All you got to do is come over here to layer panel. We'll talk more about the layers and just unlock that. Oh, also I had a selection. One thing to note, you can't do anything outside of your selection. All right. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to do this again. I'm going to option click, come up, and then paint. Now, if you notice, down in the sand, you're going to see the crosshair and the paintbrush are staying perfectly aligned. If I come over this way, I'm starting to clone the glass up into that other space. So the relationship between the crosshair and the paintbrush stays the same if I hold down this. If I let go and do it, it's going to and paint again, it's going to stay the same. Okay. Now this obviously makes no sense what I just did, but it just shows you that relationship of the tool. So how I would actually use this is I would come over here. I would say, okay, this section of the sand is what I want in this area here. So I'm going to option click here, and then come over there and start painting that out. Okay, that works really well. Right? Yeah.
So did you click the sand first, and that's like what you wanted to use, and then you just
Yes. So if you see,
click what you want to use?
yeah, I click where I want the clone to come from. Capture. Yeah, that's a good word. Capture from, and then the second click tells me where I want to put it, and that relationship stays the same. Okay. So if you look now, it's going to stay in that kind of horizontal relationship there. And if as I move this up, it's going to take that out. You see what it did? It wasn't perfect. It cut into the horizon line. All right, so you got to be careful with this. Generally, what people do when they clone stamp is they constantly move where they're cloning from. See how I kind of fixed that? I need a little more adjustment there. But I'm starting to fix that. When you're clone stamping, you want to constantly move where you're clone stamping from, because if you don't, what happens is you end up with repeated patterns, and you don't want that. You don't want that same cloud to pop up in different places, right? You want things to move around. All right, so I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. I'm sorry. So we have selections, making complex selections using the add to and subtract. We start to do something with them. I inadvertently jumped forward there a little bit. Let me show you a couple other things here in relation to making selections and filling or clone stamping. Let's go back to this one. All right. I showed you how that content aware fill worked. Let's say I want to take this tree out. I make a loose selection round. I go to fill, content aware, and it completely breaks. All right, it doesn't work for this kind of image. Mainly because this has a lot of extraneous stuff here that is patterned, and you see it doesn't understand how a pattern works, fits together. So you can't really use that over things that have a definitive pattern or a grid kind of system. So that's not how you would do this. It'd be much, much more complex to take the tree out of the front of this building than it is to take the glass off the beach. The beach has an organic, fairly even background that you can work with, okay? So when you're removing stuff, you need to pay attention to that. It works much better in some areas than others, in certain ways in other things, all right? Let's go back to this one. All right. I'm going to introduce you to quick select and how to erase, erase something so there's no pixels there, and how to fill something in with a color. Okay. And then I'm going to let you start to do this a little bit. Yeah.
But if you were trying to like take away that tree,
Mm-hmm.
like since the background was too complex, how would you get rid of the tree when you just
I wouldn't probably, but if I had to, I would start with the clone stamp tool, and I would try to say draw this down through here. One thing I could do is like say, you know, you'd have to really break this down. This is why people get paid decent money for doing really fancy edits, okay? Because it takes time. I would do something like this. I would grab my polygonal lasso tool. I would come up here. I would do this in sections. So I would make a selection that fits like a section, like that, okay? And then I would start with the clone stamp tool, and I would make that a lot smaller, number one. And you see how this can kind of grab something like that. So I would select from there, and then I would come over. Now this is a kind of a tricky operation here, like that. And I have to do this kind of over and over again. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to get me started on that thing. And you notice that as I'm clone stamping this, like that. So you see how I would do? I would take it in pieces. Now, it would take a lot of work, right? Because as you do this, you start to take out more and more of it, you're going to start to notice things that are kind of weird. And then you got to go back and kind of fix those weirdness places like that. So that's how I would do that. All right. Oh, let's go back to the beach. All right, so let's take a look at our next two, or actually, let's take a look at the magnetic lasso tool first. So the lasso tools, you know, we draw a selection or we do a straight edge selection. Well, the first step in the computer-aided type of selection is being able to kind of let the computer find edges. You know, we have all this pixel information here. Well, the computer knows certain things. It doesn't know this is a glass on a beach. Google probably knows this is a glass on a beach, actually, because their AI recognizes these images now. Photoshop doesn't know that. But what Photoshop does know is that these pixels here are a different color and significantly darker than these pixels here. So what Photoshop can do is snap a line to that edge. This is the magnetic lasso tool. So if I start to draw around and I just get close, so you can kind of see how it's kind of snapping to that. Just like that. Now it's not perfect if I get too far from it, but that snaps a line to that. And you can see I actually came off of that a little bit. Whoops. I came off a little bit right there. This goes to my kind of the next point. You need to refine your selection. So if I had this selection, I know, okay, that's pretty good, but I got a little mess up there. What I'm going to do is come up, grab my regular lasso tool. I'm going to subtract from selection. And since this isn't too big of an area, I'm going to draw over that and subtract that out. Like that. I'm going to fix it. The more time you put in your selections, the better your operation, whatever you're doing, is going to be. Okay? Yeah.
Is there a marquee tool that's basically a brush to remove selections?
Is there a marquee tool, a brush?
Yeah, like I mean, you have to draw like you just drew a shape around that area, but is there like a brush?
There it is. Yeah. We won't get to that for a while because that gets into a whole nother thing about masking.
Right.
We will get to that probably next class. Okay, so I have a selection around this thing. So let's say I just want to erase this like Charles Cohen. A quick way to do that is to go to Edit, and we can clear it like that. That actually removes those pixels. So Edit, Clear. I can also, if I don't want to clear it, but I want to save those pixels for later, I can make a new layer. I haven't gotten into layers much yet, but I went down and I hit the little new page icon down there, made a new layer, make sure that layer is selected. Grab my paintbrush, grab my black or white paint. Sorry. We'll get into the nuance of this in a little bit. And I can just go fill that up like that. Remember, you can select colors, do various things with that. Like that. Or I can go to Edit and Fill. Select a color, solid color this way. That. Feel like that. There's all sorts of different things I can do in there. If I wanted to, I'm just kind of throwing a bunch of stuff at you right now that I want you to kind of look for and play with. I can also come over here and grab the paint bucket. That's going to fill with whatever color I have selected here. Like that. If I go under the paint bucket, or over the paint bucket, I can grab the gradient tool. Fill like that. Anytime I make that selection, I can do all sorts of fun stuff in that space. Okay. So that is a magnetic lasso tool with a little adjustment and some filling. Let's go back to this. Now, magnetic lasso tool is actually a bit of an older technology. If I go down to the next tool, it's the quick selection tool. All right. If I hover over this, you're going to see that the quick selection tool is a circle with a plus sign in the middle. That is close to a paintbrush. It's not quite. It's close. But what that does is similar to the magnetic lasso. It allows me to paint the selection over a thing. You're going to see as I click and drag, the computer is going to try and kind of grab what it thinks I want. Okay. This oftentimes is the quickest way to make a selection, which is good because it's called the quick selection. And it does pretty well. You can see I got off of it a little bit. Whoops. A little bit there, a little more there. Now, you can see the default on this tool is add to selection. Okay, all the other ones start a new selection. The default on the quick selection is adding to it. So if I come up here, I have the glass selected. I need a little more of this edge selected here so I can paint over that. It just adds to it. If I want the straw, then I paint up the straw like so. Okay. Now, I'm going to introduce the last thing here to you, and then I'm going to let you go. And that is the idea of a modifier key. Okay. You saw as I was working with this, I made some changes to it. So right now the quick select is a paintbrush with a plus sign in the middle. If I hold the Option key down on the keyboard, it makes a minus sign in the middle. That means it's going to take away from that selection, okay? If I paint over that area, it's going to remove that selection, okay? That Option key is what's called a modifier key, all right? So what that does is that modifies the tool that is selected. So you're going to see it works in a lot of tools. So here, if I have the elliptical or the rectangular marquee, and I hold the modifier key over it, or the Option key, it's going to create a subtraction sign. If I hold the Shift key, it's a plus. And if I hold the Command key, it is a move sign. So I can modify that tool by what key I hold. I use this a lot, makes things a lot faster. It replicates these buttons up here. But
Which one was plus?
for this tool, it is the Shift key. Okay. Any keys that generally just do something in the tool are called modifier keys, and they kind of vary by tool to tool. The other thing you're going to use, like, is in the Quick Select tool. If I want to make that bigger and smaller, this works in paintbrushes too, is the right and left bracket key. Okay, it's next to the P key. If I do the right bracket key, makes those things bigger. If I do the left bracket key, makes them smaller. All right, with the Quick Select tool, that's important because you want the selection area to be a little bit smaller than what you're selecting so you can paint over it. Does that make sense? All right. All right. Now from here, I could obviously go in and do any of my selections, like paint. You notice my brush is really big there. If I wanted it to be smaller, left bracket. Paint over stuff. So that covers selections and a few different operations you can do with those selections. I know that was like 2 hours of talking almost. I'm sorry. It just takes a while to get through it. This is kind of the baseline information. But I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to let you guys, I'm going to show you how to get